Hi, thanks for joining us today for this ranch riding webinar. Thanks to Dr. Jenny Ivey at the University of Tennessee for putting this horse judging at home series together. I'm excited to be here with you to conduct our first seminar in the series, which is going to be on ranch riding. My name is Dr. Holly Spooner, and I'm one of the horse science faculty here at Middle Tennessee State. Over the last few years, I've had the great opportunity to coach our horse judging team at MTSU, and before that was the coach of our stock horse team. In both of these, one of my favorite events is the ranch riding class. As I'm sure you know, ranch riding is a relatively new class in terms of our horse shows, but continues to grow in popularity. So today we'll look at how we judge our ranch riding class, and I'm hopeful that this will be useful to you if you're a member of a horse judging team or if you're an exhibitor who wants to show ranch riding and understand a little bit more about what it is the judges are looking for. So let's get started. So an overview of what we'll talk about today, we'll begin with what I consider to be rule number one, or the very first thing that we should do when learning to judge our ranch riding classes. We'll then do a very brief overview of how we judge our scored classes in general. That would be our things like our reining, our Western riding, and our trail classes. Then we'll delve into more of the ranch riding, beginning with the purpose of the ranch riding class and that overall idea we're looking for when judging these horses. Then we'll go into each of the maneuvers specifically and give you an opportunity to be the judge. We'll let you apply some scores to those maneuvers and then compare those back to my scores. We'll do the same thing on finding some penalty examples. And at the end, there are a couple of practice runs if you'd like to try your hand at judging those. And finally, we'll finish with our concluding thoughts. So rule number one, anytime we're judging an event, it's important to know the rules that we're judging it by. This is sort of like playing basketball without knowing the rules for basketball. You'd want to make sure you understood that you had to dribble, that there was a difference between a 2 and a 3-point shot. You'd want to know what the free throw line was about. So knowing our rule book is rule number one for judging or participating in our ranch riding class. Because ranch riding is a relatively new class, we've seen some changes over time. The class today doesn't exactly look like what it looked like when it was first approved. Different associations may also judge the class differently, so it's important to know the association which you plan to participate in's rules, or which rules your judging contest might be following. For many of us, that's the American Quarter Horse Association rulebook, and that's what we'll be putting our emphasis on today. There are differences from association to association, however. In some associations, our ranch riding class is more of a rail class, but for AQHA, again, which we'll focus on, it is a pattern class and is judged using a scoring sheet. You also want to know the rules about things like holding onto the saddle horn, which is permitted in some associations, including AQHA, but not in others, such as the American Ranch Horse. Another example of differences from association to association is the use of artificial tails, which, for example, are permitted in the Pony of the Americas, but not in AQHA. Silver on the saddle might be another example. Typically for our horse judging contests, though, we consider all tack, attire, and riding styles to be considered legal. So this may not be something you want to spend a huge amount of time on learning the specific nuances of, unless you're looking at participating as an exhibitor. So let's do a brief review of how we judge scored classes. Scored classes are individually ran classes where each competitor is sort of competing against themselves or an ideal situation. It's not like Western Pleasure, where we simply pick the best horse in the pen that day. In a scored class, each of the maneuvers of the pattern or the class receive a score. There are also some penalties that are spelled out in the rulebook that, if they occur, are applied to that maneuver. So our score is going to consist of a maneuver, or what we might call a content score, and then applying penalties as they occur. It's important, though, to remember to judge on the positive. Oftentimes, we get very focused on what went wrong or what looks bad, and we want to take away from horses, but we may not want to give them a positive score when that occurs. Our scale for our maneuver scores range from -1.5 to +1.5. we know that 0 falls in the middle of that spectrum, and we consider 0 to be a correct maneuver. If that maneuver has some degree of difficulty, or is good, very good, or excellent, it receives a positive score. We denote a +1/2 to mean good, a +1 to be very good, and a +1.5 score for an excellent maneuver. Now notice it doesn't say perfect. It's rare that we would see something be perfect, but if it's excellent, go ahead and reward it with that +1.5. On the other side of the spectrum, our scores range from -1.5 poor, -1 very poor, or -1.5 extremely poor. After our run, and we've scored each maneuver, we add or subtract those maneuver scores, and then subtract any penalties that occurred during the run from a score of 70. That 70 is the starting point for all of our horses in our scored classes. As the rulebook tells us, our scores then can range from 0 to 100. Here's an example of a score sheet. As you can see, this comes from AQHA and is the score sheet for ranch riding pattern 2. Up here at the top, the judge would fill in which show, class, and the date of the class. The middle is what I like to call the cheat sheet. This is where it goes ahead and lists for us some of the penalties that we may commonly see, so we can quickly look up and refer to that if need be. But ideally, we'd have those penalties memorized. Down here is the score sheet itself. As you can see, it reminds us of our maneuver score range. Then we have our maneuver descriptions. If we set this alongside our ranch riding pattern 2, we'd see that maneuver 1 is a walk. Maneuver 2 is a trot. 3 is an extended trot. 4 is a left lead lope. 5 is a stop with 1.5 turns to the right. 6 is an extended lope, and so forth throughout the class. On this side is where we write the working order number, which just would be 1 through however many entries we had in the class, and then that horse's back number. But from a judging contest perspective, we often just use 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. As we go across our score sheet, you can see we have a row that reflects penalties and a row that reflects content. That content is another name for our maneuver score. So if we look at this score sheet that I've filled out here, we can see that our first horse receives a 0 on the walk, a +1/2 on the trot, a +1/2 on the extended trot, and so forth as we make our way across. This horse does receive a 3-point penalty on maneuver 8, which is a changing of lead. It's likely that that horse trotted more than 3 strides during that simple lead change. We can also see this horse had a 1-point penalty during its walkovers. Perhaps that was a break of gait at the walk or trot for 2 strides or less. So as we go across, we can see that we have the penalty total box where we've added up the penalties from the duration of the run, so 4. And then we add or subtract our maneuver scores. From that score of 70, subtract off 4, and we can see that this horse completes the class with a score of 65.5. If we look at horse 2, this horse had a penalty-free run. This horse also had some +1s and +1/2s in its maneuver scores, causing this horse to finish with a score of 75. Once all of our horses have been scored, we simply arrange those scores in numeric order from highest to lowest for the placing of our class. If we have a tie, typically that tie is broken first on the horse who has the fewest number of penalties. After that, the judge can select a maneuver to break that tie on. Hopefully, if we've done our job in rewarding horses on the positive side, taking away with need be, we'll get a range of scores that does not have many ties. So now that you understand a little bit more about how we score our scored classes, including our ranch riding, let's talk more about ranch riding itself. Let's begin with the purpose of the class.
The purpose of a ranch riding class is to measure the ability of the horse to be a pleasure to ride while being used as a means of conveyance from performing one ranch task to another. The horse should reflect the versatility, attitude, and movement of a working ranch horse riding outside the confines of an arena. The horse should be well trained, relaxed, quiet, soft, and cadenced at all gaits. The ideal ranch horse will travel with forward movement and demonstrate an obvious lengthening of stride at extended gaits. The horse can be ridden with light contact or on a relatively loose rein without requiring undue restraint, but not shown on a full drape of reins. The overall manners and responsiveness of the ranch riding horse to make timely transitions in a smooth and correct manner, as well as the quality of the movement, are of primary considerations. The ideal ranch riding horse should have a natural head carriage at each gait.
So the description that you just heard came from our AQHA rulebook at the beginning of the rules for ranch riding. So it really describes the purpose. And you heard words like a natural ranch horse who should be able to perform tasks on the ranch or to carry you from point to point across the ranch. I took the description from the AQHA rulebook, as well as the paint horse, the American ranch horse, and several others, and came up with this word cloud here. And I think it does a good job of helping us to find some of the words that describe our ranch riding horse, or the things that we should be looking at as the judge. One of the first words that jumps out to me is natural. We want our ranch riding horses to appear as natural as possible. We don't want them to appear manufactured or robotic. They should be that horse who's happy to perform his job again in traveling across that ranch. Our focus is on gaits. We're going to ask that horse to perform the walk, trot, and lope, as well as extended versions like we see here, where we want that horse to show us a lengthening of stride throughout the class. We want the ranch riding horse to be mannerly. He should be soft and yielding to the bridle. He should be responsive and relaxed, as well as attentive along the way. The ranch riding horse should show us versatility. He looks like a horse who should be able to move up and do something with cows, for example, as a ranch horse job. We want him to walk forward. We want him to, again, have length of stride and be ground covering in his trots, smooth in his transitions. We want his gaits to be rhythmic. If we're going to ride this ranch riding horse all day, he needs to be a comfortable ride. So all of those things are considerations that we're going to put in our mind when thinking about what those ideal ranch horse maneuvers look like. As far as our class routine, as I've mentioned, AQHA does ranch riding as a pattern class. What will happen is the judge will select one of 15 approved patterns from the rulebook. Each of these patterns contains the gaits of walk, trot, extended trot, lope, and extended lope. Typically, the horse will perform that lope on both leads and the extended lope on at least one lead throughout the pattern. It'll also include a stop and back. Then there are a minimum of 3 optional maneuvers. These optional maneuvers include the turnaround or spin, the side pass, walk, trotting, or loping over logs, or even a gait in some of our patterns. Let's watch a short video that's an excellent example of a ranch riding class that includes a few of these optional maneuvers, including that gait. Now, in this pattern, you will see cattle involved. Typically, that's not something we would see necessarily at a weekend show, but more at our upper level competitions in AQHA, such as our world level horse shows.
Stay zero maneuver. This is the winning run in the senior ranch riding. The horse comes in bright with a lot of expression, moves right up into a very nice extended trot, negotiates the bushes in a nice way, picks up nicely into its left lead. Again, nice bright expression, soft, very nice mover, moves straight through his entire body down into the transition to the trot, maintains his cadence through the tight turn, up into the extended trot. Again, bright expression, great mover, very pleasing to watch, very pleasing to ride. Nice, soft, forward moving walk, again, with the same expression he has had through the entire class. Picks up into the right lead and moves forward straight down to the transition to the trot. Again, maintains his cadence in the turn, picks up into the left lead extended lope. This maneuver was a correct maneuver. Pushed on the bridle a bit through the lead change and came down into the collection. This was the only spot in the pattern that the horse was a 0 maneuver for me. Came down to the trot nice, trotted right up to the gate, moves forward as asked, again in the bridle, soft, is aware of the cattle, keeps the gate barely open, enough for the horse to pass, but the cattle not to get through. Another +1 maneuver. Horse negotiates the logs carefully, safely. Again, same expression, aware of his surroundings. No interruption in his pace. Up to the right-hand gate. Again, protecting the opening of the gate. Closes it and softly moves into the walk. Again, a forward moving walk. This is the 14th maneuver of the pattern. Still a very nice, bright expression. Another +1 maneuver. The 360 to the right and 360 to the left and the back all are 1 maneuver. The horse does not finish the 360 to the left. However, with a +1/2, 0, and again a +1/2 back, just a 0 maneuver. Very nice run.
Great. So some of the things that stand out to us as we watch that run include how many times the judge says bright expression. That horse shows us an excellent expression throughout that pattern. He's also a great mover, ground covering, soft in his hitting the ground, and having good collection of his body, as well as extension when needed throughout. Let's talk about each of our maneuvers individually now. So in the following clips, we'll allow a maneuver example to play, give you an opportunity to think about how you would score that, again, from that -1.5 to +1.5 score, and then I'll give you my score on that.
One of the most important gaits, the walk is a natural, flat-footed, 4-beat gait. The gait is rhythmic and ground covering. As in all gaits, the horse should display a level or slightly above level top line with a bright, attentive expression.
So that was our description of the walk. Again, ground covering, bright attentive expression, and a willing performer throughout. Now you be the judge. I scored this a +1/2. I appreciate how purposefully and ground covering this horse walks. She's also a good mover, even at the walk. The one thing I might change about this horse is for her to relax just a bit more in her neck and stretch her neck and nose out there just a bit. She's slightly upright and arched in that neck, but again, not something that distracts from the overall quality of the maneuver. Let's try another walk. Sorry, let's get that to play just a bit more for you. So go ahead and think about your score for that. I scored this walk a -1. I would consider this to be very poor. You can see at the start, the horse nearly charges off. Throughout it, he requires undue restraint from the rider. He's interested in things outside the arena, and he walks with a shorter, choppier stride, especially for his larger size. I would consider this to be very poor. Let's look at another example of the walk. Sorry for the interruption. The joys of working from home during all of this. So let's start this clip over and again judge another example of our walk. Okay, I think it's working now. So again, our third example of our walk here. Let's try it again. So we appreciate this horse is broke and willing. It's calm throughout the run. However, this horse doesn't show us as purposeful or as ground covering as a walk. You can see it leaves its hocks out behind it throughout the go. I would consider this to be overall correct, however, not credit earning.
The trot is a natural two-beat gait that demonstrates more forward motion than the Western jog. Horses should be alert and be ridden on light contact, but not a full drape of rein.
So again, we hear words like ground covering, light contact. We want these horses to trot. This is not necessarily our Western jog. Thus, we describe it as the trot in our ranch riding classes. Here's our first example for you to judge. Let's see that again. This is a good to very good example of the trot. This horse is consistent in his frame, and he's a good mover. He's also a willing performer throughout the duration of the clip. It's important, or I should note, that some of these clips you'll see will have a range of scores. Uh, This is because it's not necessarily um, absolutely correct that you be one or the other of these scores. But if you're a +1/2 to a +1 in that range, that's where this horse needs to go. Now, if you're on the negative side of the spectrum, there needs to be some adjustment in your scoring. Let's try another example of the trot. So, unlike our last example, this horse is not as ground covering in her trot. She's a bit bracier on the bridle and takes a shorter, choppier stride. This results in a score of minus one half.
The extended trot is an obvious lengthening of the stride with a definite increase in pace. The horse should be moving in a manner as if it were covering a large area on a ranch with an above level top line.
So, again, we want our horses at the extended trot to be ground covering and forward. One note here is that our riders can stand or post as well as continue setting during the extended trot. That is all at the rider's option in order to do what they think will be most beneficial to their horse. We're not going to judge how that rider performs the extended trot, but simply how the horse performs the extended trot. This is a minus half to minus one poor to very poor demonstration of our extended trot. Despite its larger size, we see that this horse is not very ground covering in his trot. He's also a bit resistant to the rider, particularly when the rider takes a hold of the horse's face and he becomes a bit bracy in his mouth. So, again, we'd consider this to be minus half to minus one, poor to very poor. Here's another example of an extended trot. So remember when I watched this clip with the judging team, I think my comment was this horse is getting it. This horse is really going somewhere when it comes to his trot. He's covering some ground and doing so in a very willing expression. Towards the end of the clip, he comes back to the rider very handily. This is an example of a plus one to plus one and a half, or a very good to excellent extended trot.
The lope is a 3-beat gait that should be relaxed and smooth with a natural forward moving stride.
So again, in our lope, we want this horse to be forward moving, to have good drive off his hock, be round in his back, and again, willing with a bright expression. This is a correct to good example of the lope. This horse is smooth, good moving, and willing throughout the lope. He's covering ground in an appropriate manner. Again, correct to good. Here's another example of the lope for you to judge. By contrast, this horse is much less willing. She shows resistance at the start of the lope, as well as requiring a tighter restraint and handling throughout the course of the lope. We'd consider this to be a minus half to minus one, or poor to very poor maneuver. Another example of the lope. I would consider this lope to be correct. This horse is consistent in her frame, although she's not a great mover to earn that higher degree of difficulty or that more positive score. Again, this lope is considered correct. Let's look at some versions of the extended lope. I would consider this extended lope to be poor to very poor. This horse doesn't show us much in terms of extension down this outside line here. We'd like for the horse to certainly be covering more ground and reaching out more. The horse also shows us a good deal of resistance as it comes around the end of the arena, resulting in that poor to very poor score. Here's another extended lope. This clip is quite grainy at the beginning, and I apologize for that. Excuse me, let's see if we can make that replay. Well, it didn't do it, but I think most of you probably saw that this, in the parts we can see, is an excellent or very good lope. This horse's ground covering, it's really going somewhere, as well as showing us um, great consistency in its frame throughout, and it's responsive to the rider. So again, a very good to excellent extended lope. Let's look at some examples of our optional maneuvers. We'll start with how the horse should cross the logs.
Logs should be approached square and straight. Credit will be given to horses who negotiate the obstacle with speed without sacrificing correctness. In addition, horses should be attentive and have the capability of picking their own way through the logs.
Let's look at some examples of horses going over the logs. This horse does a good job completing its walkover of the logs. It doesn't interrupt its pace and finds the spacing between the logs quite easily. We'd consider this to be a good maneuver.
The lead change should be straight, soft, and willing. Credit will be placed on smoothness, even cadence of gaits, and the horse's ability to change leads.
Our ranch riding classes require a lead change. However, unlike our reining class, this does not need to be a flying lead change. Either a flying or a simple lead change can be performed in the ranch riding. If the horse chooses to perform a simple lead change, it's important that the horse not trot beyond 3 strides. Doing so results in a penalty. Let's look at an example of our lead change. This horse earns a score of minus half. While the lead change is simultaneous and is performed as a flying lead change, the horse increases its pace substantially through and immediately following the change, resulting in the rider having to take a hold or handle the horse. Thus, we would consider this to be a minus half poor change. Here's another example of a lead change. Let's try to watch that one again. Sorry. This is an example of a very good lead change. The horse is rather imperceivable in its lead change. In fact, the best lead changes are those where it looks like it doesn't even happen. The horse stays consistent in its frame and its top line stays straight in its body. That's what we see in this example, making this a very good lead change.
The turn should be quick and handy without sacrificing correctness or form.
It's important to note that we don't require the horse to perform a spin, as in we might see in our reining class, although the turnaround may resemble that for some of our horses. Still, that horse just needs to be a willing performer who turns readily without showing us resistance, ideally with maintaining a relatively stationary hind end. It also does not need to be a perfect horsemanship type pivot either. Let's look at some examples of our turns. You be the judge. I scored this turn a minus half. It's very full, very poor as a result of the resistance the horse shows. You see him gape at the mouth and being unwilling to turn at the start of the turn maneuver. Certainly, it improves over time, but this turn still earns a minus one. Here's another example. This turn is a +1 to +1.5 maneuver. This first horse turns incredibly quickly, rolling back over its hock. We see a low center of gravity, much like we'd see in our reining type horse. The horse exits the turn very willingly as well, again, making this a +1 to +1.5, very good to excellent turn.
The stop should be smooth yet hard, holding the ground. When asked to back, the horse should back straight with no resistance to the rider.
Again, our ranch riding stop doesn't need to be a reining stop. The horse doesn't need to slide an excessive distance. However, we do want the horse to stop on its hind end. The horse should also stay quiet through the mouth and turn that stop into an effective backup without undue hesitation. Here's our first example of a stop and back. This stop would receive a 0 score. The horse does stop on the hind end. However, as the horse is asked to back, it shows you some resistance in the face, as well as backing slightly crooked, making the maneuver as a whole a minus half poor to zero or correct maneuver. Here's another example of a stop and back. This stop and back earns a plus half to a plus one score. The horse stops readily on its hind end and immediately begins to back up purposefully, staying quiet in the mouth. This horse is a bit higher in his head carriage, although that's perfectly acceptable and a bit more of that horse's style. So now that we've been through several of our maneuvers, let's talk a bit about penalties. Again, we only assess penalties as they happen. And if we have any doubt, that doubt's going to go to the benefit of the horse. Our ranch riding penalties include 1 point penalties for things like being over bridled or behind the bridle or behind the vertical, as we may call it. Being out of frame, that's when that horse is really dragging his nose in the dirt or traveling in such a way that would not be considered acceptable in a ranch type horse. And either of those can happen on each maneuver. So we can have several 1 point penalties along the way for that horse that maybe doesn't quite or doesn't fit our type in that sense. A horse that's too slow can also have that 1 point penalty. But the most common penalty for 1 point we would see would be that break of gait at the walk or trot for 2 strides or less. 3 point penalties include such things as being on the wrong lead or out of lead, breaking gait at the lope, breaking gait at the walk or trot for more than 2 strides, being out of lead or cross cantering more than 2 strides when changing leads, trotting more than 3 strides when making that simple lead change, or severely disturbing any obstacle. That's essentially hitting the poles or messing them up to the extent that they would have to be reset in a major fashion. 5 point penalties include blatant disobediences. That's those things like kicking out, biting, bucking, rearing. Each time those occur, that's a 5 point penalty. Towards the right hand side of your score sheet is a penalty column that says 10 point penalty. That 10 point penalty box can be used over the course of the pattern for a horse that shows an unnatural ranch horse appearance. For AQHA, this is really focusing on that horse whose tail is obviously or consistently carried in an unnatural or deadened manner in every maneuver. Then we get to what we might consider our zero scores or being off pattern. Those happen when a horse eliminates a maneuver or has an incomplete maneuver, such as being asked to stop and turning 1 1/2 times, and that horse maybe turns just 1/2 times. That would be considered an incomplete maneuver. We also use that off pattern if two hands touch the reins, more than one finger comes between the reins with split reins, or any finger between the reins with our romal. We can also have disqualifications, which we would handle the same as a zero score from a judging perspective. Those are illegal equipment, including hoof black, braided or banded manes or tail extensions, or things like willful abuse, major disobedience or schooling, or those horses that are considered lame. We'll look at a few examples of penalties. Again, allowing the clip to play twice through so that you can assess that penalty, and then there'll be a description of the penalty if and when it occurred.
In this example, the required gait is the extended trot. If this horse breaks to a lope for more than 2 strides, it requires a penalty of 3.
So, anytime we see a horse break gait from the trot up into that lope, we need to start counting strides. So, we can see that this horse lopes about 4 strides before returning to the trot. That results in that penalty score of 3.
In this clip, the pattern calls for an extended trot to a stop. This horse breaks to the lope for 2 strides prior to the stop, therefore receiving a penalty of 1.
So again, when we see this horse pick up into that lope, again, if we'll start counting strides, we see this horse completes 2 lope strides before stopping, resulting in that 1-point penalty.
The prescribed gait is the extended trot. There are 2 penalty 3s for each time this horse breaks to the lope more than 2 strides. This rider also places his free hand on the reins, therefore the overall score is 0.
So, as was just explained, this horse actually occurs 2 3-point penalties because it breaks into the lope twice during the course of the extended trot. In our score sheet, we would put 3 2 times in the box. We would not add that together to write down 6 as an example. Each penalty is scored individually.
Although this horse hits the first log as she walks in, this is not a penalty and should only be taken from the maneuver score.
So again, in our maneuvers involving logs, there is no penalty unless those equipment is severely disturbed. We would not consider this hit to be a severe disturbance, and thus no penalty has happened. We could simply reflect it in our maneuver score. So now that you've seen some examples of some penalties, as well as the examples we showed before of our maneuver scores, it's time to put it all together. There are 2 runs that follow that will allow to play completely through. And after that, I'll show you an example of my scorecard. So you may want to take some time to pause the video and use a scorecard of your own. This is AQHA's Ranch Riding Pattern 2 as an example. So here's our pattern. The horses will enter at the walk, here around the end of the arena. They'll pick up a trot. They'll move into the extended trot around the end, lope down the side, stop, perform 1 1/2 turns to the right. They'll do an extended lope back down the side, collect to a lope in the corner around the end of the arena, come across, change leads to a left lead lope. Then they'll walk over the poles or our logs, pick up a trot, move to the extended trot, into the stop, and back up. So again, there are 2 examples for you to be the judge on. Here's horse 1. So a brief pause, and use your pause button on your video if you need to continue to take notes, but we'll move on to horse number 2. And another brief pause for your note taking. So here's the score sheet that I have from the 2 runs that you just saw. So for horse number 1, we see this horse was good at its trot, extended trot, receives a 0 on the left lead lope, -1/2 for the stop, turn to the right, -1/2 on the extended lope, back to a 0 for that collected right lead lope. Receives a 3-point penalty during the lead change for hanging the hind lead behind, meaning that the horse had changed leads in front but not behind. And here we have a 0 score. This horse completely eliminates the walk maneuver prior to the walkovers, resulting in a final score of 0. Now, I did continue on in providing scores there for you to use and comparing them back to your own scores in case you completed the scoring of that run as well. That horse also lopes into the first step of those walkovers, which I did assess a 1-point penalty for that break of gait at the walk for 2 strides or less. But again, finishing the run with a 0 score for eliminating that maneuver number 9, the walk. Our second horse has a penalty-free performance. This horse is excellent or very good in several maneuvers, earning +1 scores and several plus halves along the way. I appreciate this horse's expression throughout the class and its ground covering trots in particular. This horse completes the class with a score of 75. So for some concluding thoughts, it's important to always keep in mind the class purpose. When you find yourself debating over what score to assess, think back to that natural appearing ranch horse who needs to be forward moving, ground covering, and something that you'd want to ride every day as you cross the ranch. Make sure that you're giving credit where credit is due. Don't be afraid to use that positive side of your scoring scale. Avoid judging style. The horses should go in a style that suits their conformation. That may mean that some of them are a bit higher headed, some of them are a bit lower headed, but if they're willing and yielding to the bridle, then they're doing what they need to do and they're doing their job. Anytime you have a question, the benefit of the doubt needs to go to the horse. We need to be 100% certain that a penalty occurred before we give that horse that penalty. Otherwise, benefit of the doubt, back to the horse. So that concludes our ranch riding webinar for today. I appreciate the opportunity to have some time to share this class with you. I think we'll continue to see growth as we reward these ranch type horses. We do appreciate you joining us. I'd also like to give thanks to the MTSU Stock Horse team who helped in the videos that you saw today, as well as a huge thanks to Casey and Kyle Henry who provided the videography as well as the voiceovers I used in today's webinar. Thanks for joining us.